Julie Urban is the Research Associate Professor in the Department of Entomology from Penn State University. And today she is here to talk to us about spotted lanternfly in the U.S., what we've learned after 8 years, and what new regions need to know to be prepared. Thank you so much for joining us, Julie.
Thank you, Cindy. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you everyone for being here. I want to tell you basically about this pest, what you need to know and kind of be concerned about and be prepared about spotted lanternfly if it ever does get here in California. And so we've learned a lot over the course of the past, nearly a decade with spotted lanternfly in eastern US. And so our growers in the eastern US, we weren't prepared. And so we've learned a lot since that time, but we want you to benefit from what we, with the growers have collectively learned. And so let's get started. You'll get a little bit of biology, but essentially I'm telling you the story of this invasive insect to date. Okay, and so spotted lanternfly is a plant hopper, and so the closest relative that you're probably most familiar with is glassy-winged sharpshooter. And so, like glassy-winged sharpshooter, plant hoppers, spotted lanternfly is a sap feeder. Their mouth parts are fused into a straw-like beak, as you can see here. And unlike glassy-winged sharpshooter, spotted lanternfly is primarily a phloem feeder rather than a xylem feeder. But basically, even a phloem feeder will pass through and sip on xylem and whatnot. So it's not exclusive, but it's primarily a phloem feeder. And so spotted lanternfly, here you can see, it has hair-like stylets inside that straw-like beak that it inserts into the plant tissue. So here you can see it doing its damage, feeding on plant tissue. And so spotted lanternfly was first detected in the US in Berks County, which is a rural region of eastern Pennsylvania, September 22nd, 2014. And so spotted lanternfly was an invasive species detected in South Korea in 2004. And there it was reported to damage a lot of different crops. Grape received the most damage, but it was also reported as a significant pest damaging a bunch of other things, tree fruit, stone fruit, ornamentals, timber. And so we were very concerned when this did arrive. And so it was detected in, as I said, in fall of 2014. And much, from what was learned from South Korea and from where it appeared in Berks County, we're pretty sure the spotted lanternfly got here as an egg mass. And so it was like ground zero, that site of first detection was in a stone yard that imported stone from around the world, but from a lot from Asia. And so you can see here a spotted lanternfly egg mass on stone, actually, at that stone yard. And so spotted lanternfly is really unusual among sap-feeding insects because most sap-feeding insects will lay their eggs where their offspring can feed, which is, on a host, because when the nymphs, as you can see on the right, hatch out, they don't have wings. And so normally other insects would facilitate them being put on a food source right away. But lanternflies and other plant hoppers in this lanternfly family, the Fulgoridae family, this is common. They'll lay their eggs on anything. And that's likely because these insects are very prolificous. They'll feed on over 100 different species of plants and shrubs. And so why I'm showing you these dates here is that back in September 2014, within 2 weeks of that initial detection, Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and USDA APHIS immediately placed a quarantine around the area where lanternfly was detected. They did a survey and circumscribed, what townships lanternfly was found in. And they also pulled together a technical working group of scientists from around the US. And I was part of that. I wasn't working at Penn State at the time. But they brought us in to help advise on spotted lanternfly management. I happen to have a background in evolutionary biology on plant hoppers and these insects. So, I knew a little bit about the biology, but again, nothing was really known well about the biology of this insect, pretty much except from what we knew from South Korea. And so in spring of that following year, they brought the technical working group, they brought us up to Pennsylvania. And this was a picture I took of an egg mass on stone in that stone yard. And in May, we actually saw the first hatchlings of that year. And so, besides laying their eggs on essentially anything, here you can see them again laid on stone. Sometimes they have a proteinaceous cover that stays intact. But basically you can see that if you're going to lay your eggs on anything and your eggs are this cryptic, it's really, really hard to see, even though they're there in this picture. And so it's not surprising that lanternfly wasn't detected on this shipment of stone, despite APHIS and ports being aware of spotted lanternfly and being on the lookout for it at that time. Another thing that makes lanternfly problematic, as I said, is that it feeds on so many different things. And so this was a host list that was published back in those early days, summarizing the literature from South Korea. And what's interesting and what we've learned to date, because a lot of our information's been updated since this time based on lab and field studies and reports from growers, is that this lists pine as a host. And that's really not true. Lanternfly will feed on just about anything, but it won't feed on conifers. But what makes it an additional problem is that one of its preferred hosts here is tree of heaven, or Ailanthus altissima. And so if you might be familiar with this tree already, there's a children's book called I'm blanking on what it was called, but basically about the tree of heaven that grows out of cracks in the sidewalk. And so a tree grows in Brooklyn is what the name of that story is. But basically here you can see, this is a picture I took at that stone yard of tree of heaven. If you cut tree of heaven down, that's not sufficient to kill it. It will get angry and sprout suckers and sprout more underground. You need to treat it with an herbicide. And so, after you cut it down, which they did not here. And so here you can see spotted lanternflies are still sucking on this chopped off tree of heaven. And so tree of heaven grows in disturbed habitats. You can see it, well, here you can see it along in riparian corridors, is my understanding, but also on roadsides and in rail lines throughout the country. And so because of this tendency for lanternfly to feed on tree of heaven, again, it'll feed on a lot of other things, but this attraction to tree of heaven, which were the primary hosts where lanternfly was first detected at this ground zero site, Pennsylvania Department of Ag decided that that following season, their first attempt at treatment, what they were going to do is to target tree of heaven. And so the logic here is that they would remove 90% of the tree of heaven, leaving only males. It's a dioecious tree, so the females contribute to further generations. So remove 90% of tree of heaven. That should concentrate lanternfly on those remaining 10% trees, and then those trees would be treated as trap trees, dosed with, injected with dinotefuran. So dinotefuran, as you all know, is a neonicotinoid, and it's a systemic. And so the logic here is that this would be a way to protect as much as possible against non-target impacts. And so because tree of heaven is an introduced invasive, not a lot of native arthropods feed on it, not a lot of pollinators use it. It's kind of, it's not like maple where it's at high risk for use by other arthropods. So the logic was that here, if they were to dose these things with this neonicotinoid, then that could be a way to be safer and be more specific to only attack spotted lanternfly. And so what does that look like? And so that looks like it works. And so these are some trees that were treated with dinotefuran, and those piles of bodies are lanternflies, okay? And so this is an effective way to kill a lot of lanternflies. A Penn State Extension researcher who had been a landscaper in this area that we hired to help us out with our research on spotted lanternfly, Brian Walsh, in his yard, when he was under a heavy infestation, he injected a silver maple in his yard with dinotefuran, and he counted how many lanternflies came to that tree and fed and then died beneath the tree over the course of 7 days. So over the course of 7 days, he counted over 14,000 dead lanternfly that came and fed upon that one tree. So this looks like it's really effective if you look at those trees, but what happened? And what happened is that between 2014, you had 7 townships that were that were the original infestation, actually 6 townships. And then it spread a little bit more in 2015, and that quarantine expanded appropriately. And then quarantine was expanded to encompass those counties, those townships in blue in 2016. And then in 2017, it expanded even further. And here they decided to move to calling quarantine at a county level. Not because lanternfly was distributed equally across all of these counties in this area shown in green, but it's just that the township started to have similar names and it just got way too confusing. But my point is that, if you look here, this black area is the quarantined area in this inset that shows you a pretty large region in southeastern Pennsylvania. And so what we learned from that experience is that treating trap trees alone just isn't enough, okay? So from that early treatment, lesson learned. Why wasn't enough? It wasn't enough because they weren't fast enough to get ahead of it. And this isn't meant as a criticism for Pennsylvania or APHIS. This is meant in terms of lessons that you all need to learn to be prepared for lanternfly. In the case of Pennsylvania, there were delays. It was a delay once the pest was detected for the funding to be allocated. They were removing trees, so they had to line up the contractors to do that. You can appreciate government agencies trying to contract private contractors take some time. You're removing trees from private properties and trying to do it in a really hilly region in eastern Pennsylvania. And so again, that's just going to be a time lag. The other issue that contributed to this time lag was that when surveys were done and work was done at that stone yard, and that stone yard was fantastic. They helped out with some mulching studies. The workers there talked to the APHIS surveyors, and what they said when they were shown what these insects looked like in their nymphal instars, they reported, oh yeah, I remember seeing those around, a year before. They jump really far. We were trying to step on them. And old egg masses were detected. And so even though lanternfly was detected in 2014 at Berks, those old egg masses in these reports showed that it was there at least 1 to 2 years earlier. So again, they were behind from a time perspective early on. The other lesson to learn here is that it's highly mobile. You don't only find it on tree of heaven. And so this kind of led to some miscommunication that just want to correct here. People thought that because of this focus on treating Ailanthus for treating Ailanthus to control spotted lanternfly, that meant that lanternfly required tree of heaven to complete its life cycle, and subsequent work shows that no, that's not the case at all. There's even some places in its native range in China where tree of heaven doesn't occur, and there's populations of lanternfly, no problem. Okay, and so what has been done since that time? So since that time, Pennsylvania Department of Ag and APHIS don't just use this trap tree approach. They also use knockdown applications, typically bifenthrin. And what they're doing, you can't spray your way out of this one, but what they're doing is they're focusing on pop-up populations of lanternfly and lanternfly densities in areas that are that put the population at risk for further spread. So they're focusing on doing their treatments around airports, ports, that kind of thing. And then the other thing, Pennsylvania Department of Ag is being really, really aggressive in their work. And we have Penn State has quarterly meetings with Pennsylvania Department of Ag and with APHIS specifically to talk about spotted lanternfly. And we've been doing this since 2018. And so we just had a meeting 2 Thursdays ago, and PDA reported what treatments operations teams made this past field season. And overall, contractors treated about 500 properties within Pennsylvania, but PDA staff treated over 200 populations themselves. It makes sense. They all know where they're seeing heavy populations. They know they know what to look for. And so they're training their own staff to do treatments for spotted lanternfly, which is great. Okay, so let's go back to that invasion history. Another distinct point, I showed you that from 2015 to 2017, the population spread. Winter 2018, we see a disjunct jump. And so this map, New York State IPM has a spotted lanternfly distribution map that they update to this to this day. There's going to be a new map. I just talked to Brian Eschenauer, who is the map updater, this morning. They're going to have a new one out in after Thanksgiving. But this is what that map looked like in 2018. And what you can see is that areas in blue are areas where there's established populations of spotted lanternfly. These yellow areas, those yellow counties, are where there were detections. So where lanternfly was reported, but that subsequent surveys found that there was no established population, lanternfly gets into stuff. It gets into oftentimes nursery stock. But what we saw is that there was an established population in Winchester detected in 2018. It was detected at a junction point between a rail line and like a trucking transport hub. So it's a site where rail cars would have their goods unloaded and picked up by trucks. And so that's where it was found. And so what did we learn? We learned, which wasn't too surprising based on the Pennsylvania experience, is that spotted lanternfly spreads on conveyances, so on the vehicles transporting goods and people. It's in and on shipments, even if it's not nursery stock, even if it's anything that can be shipped on a truck or rail car, but it also moves with people. Again, at that Virginia site, what they found is that there were old egg masses there. And so once they detected it, they realized it had already been there. So they're kind of coming in behind the 8 ball again because the populations had time to establish. And that's been true for other areas. And so certainly that was true for Virginia. There was a detection in Nashville last year. And what they found is that, yes, there were egg masses there. So it had already been established in Nashville before it had been detected, and same thing in Chicago, Illinois. And so likely that's the case in other states. And so if we look at this, this is the most recent map. And what you can see is that you have established lanternfly populations in 17 states. And the ones that are kind of freaking us out, right, are these high population centers of Nashville, and certainly in terms of Chicago, Illinois, because that's a nexus for goods being transported out west. And so let's go back to what was going on in Pennsylvania. Okay, so I want to get a little bit of the life cycle in here so you understand what we were up against and what we learned. So back in 2017, as I showed you, those populations had expanded a little bit, but still were in, eastern Pennsylvania at this time. In 2017, we saw that the Pennsylvania population really seemed to boom. And what you're seeing here, these are a bunch of egg masses on a vineyard post. And this particular vineyard was a vineyard where my student who I had co-advised with the grape entomologist at the time, she was working on trying to test the efficacy of various insecticides against spotted lanternfly in a vineyard. And at this time, there were only a small handful of vineyards that had any lanternfly in them in eastern Pennsylvania. This particular vineyard, this is, spring, this is March 2017. She and the other advisor, Mike Saunders, had been working with this vineyard since 2015. They had very few lanternfly there in 2015, a little bit more in 2016. And the grower had agreed to give my student, several rows of vines that they would leave untreated, that she could use to test insecticides against lanternfly. And so we went there in the spring, rode around with the grower to try to pick where does it make sense for us to have these insecticide trials. And what we saw was really alarming. What we saw was post after post just slackered with lanternfly egg masses. And so this was like year 3 of an infestation when it really got into what looked to be high numbers. She did some work there in the summer, but then I remember the date was September 11th, and she called me and she said, Julie, you've got to see this. And I really came into vineyards. Oh, I jumped ahead of myself. So here, I need to give you the background of the life cycle here to understand why that September 11 date was so significant. Where we are and anywhere lanternfly has been to date, it only goes through one generation a year. And so it overwinters as eggs. The first instars will hatch around May. And as they hatch out, the first 3 instars are black with white spots. And what's interesting, if you want to understand lanternfly, is we need to understand what lanternfly are feeding on, because that tells us where they're going to be in the habitat. And so those early instars have relatively tiny mouth parts. They're feeding on herbaceous plants. And so what's kind of problematic is that lanternfly feeds on a bunch of different things, but those early instars are especially prolificous. They'll feed on a whole variety of plants. And so literally in my yard in Pennsylvania, one day I'll see them on the rose bushes. The next day I'll see them on Virginia creeper. They're constantly moving around, which kind of diffuses them across the landscape, making them harder to detect. The 4th instars then, which we see in early July or so, but there's a lot of overlap of life stages. They begin to feed on woody tissues. We often find them feeding on black walnut at that time. We get adults in July, but lanternflies do a really weird thing. Compared to other plant hoppers and generally other insects, they're adults for a really long time before they become reproductively mature. They don't start mating and laying eggs until September. So they're showing up, they're emerging in the end of July. They're hanging out for 2 months before they become reproductively mature. And it's in this late season that we see them exhibit these bouts of flight where they move into new areas. And we think that has to do with their reproductive biology, that they need to feed very, very heavily to become reproductively mature. And so this is what we saw when my student took a video, September 11, 2017. She saw that in that vineyard where there weren't super high SLF populations, you see they're just covering the vines. And if you see this liquid dripping out, this liquid shooting out here, you're familiar with vine mealybug, other sap feeding insects that feed on plant sap. You're feeding on sugar, so you need to excrete sugar. We call that honeydew. And by looking at that, that's, dripping off the grapes. They're not penetrating, they're not puncturing or feeding on the grapes. They're feeding on the plant sap in the vines. But looking at just that amount of honeydew kind of gives you a sense of how voraciously, how heavily they're feeding on those vines. So the other thing we saw in 2017 was that, got another call, a different, and it was this particular grower, he had a large block of apple trees. And again, this has been 3 years that my student and I had been doing work out there, we had never seen lanternfly on those apples. And this is what then it looked like just a couple weeks later. They were coming into those apples, they were moving up and flying off, but they were feeding along the way. I stood there and watched them, and they were definitely feeding. And so that's the insult to the injury, little guy landing on the camera. And so this really freaked everybody out because, especially in southeastern Pennsylvania, apple production and stone fruit production is really important economically. The other thing that kind of freaked us out is that you see them moving into maples and other ornamentals, but primarily silver and red maples. And so you get a sense of what kind of densities we're talking about. And please note that when you have a lanternfly infestation, it is never uniformly heavy. It is never, never uniform. You will have an incredibly patchy distribution where one vineyard might have a heavy infestation and literally a mile away, there's nothing. Also, in terms of what you see on individual trees, we've noticed that lanternflies show a certain fidelity to individual trees that are particularly attractive. And so my colleague Brian Walsh, he had a silver maple that was very heavily infested, but the other silver maple on the other side of his yard only had a few lanternfly. That's something we're looking into to see what it is that they're queuing into that makes certain plants attractive, to see if we can make traps out of that. But at this time in 2017, this was consistent with what we had learned from South Korea. Oh my gosh, this is really horrible. And particularly in Pennsylvania, it's going to take out our tree fruit and our timber industries. But what we've learned since that time was that, well, the South Korean literature didn't document that damage very well, and that isn't exactly as bad as we thought. And so even though you have that level of, feeding and coverage in those apples, those bugs took off after 3 weeks. No egg masses were laid there. Even to this day, we don't have any reports from growers of any damage, any feeding damage to apple or stone fruit in current areas of SLF infestation. So good news there. Other work, Tracy Lesky, who's a USDA ARS scientist in West Virginia at the Appalachian Fruit Station, they took 2-year-old saplings of potted peach and potted apple. They bagged lanternfly onto those individual trees and kind of had the lanternfly feed on them. So they force fed those to the lanternflies over the course of a season. Then they put them in the ground, and then the next year monitored the health of those saplings, and they found no significant damage even to those early saplings by lanternfly. So that was good. Similar studies here, I'll show you what we learned in terms of ornamentals. Kelly Hoover in my department worked on this, and they were interested in looking at the impact of feeding on silver maples, weeping willows, river birches, and tree of heaven. And here I want to point out another to rear lanternfly under laboratory conditions. Some labs can do it. Tracy Lesky's lab has done it very well. Melody Keena's lab with the Forest Service. They're kind of outfitted to be able to trade out trees, right? But even still, feeding lanternfly under constrained conditions is still not, they're not able to feed as well as they can in the wild environment where they can move across different hosts. And so in order to conduct this study, what they did is these were 5-year-old saplings of those 4 species that they put in the ground at this, she's now a retired extension agent's farm. And so they put lanternfly on these trees in these large enclosures and measured then the tree physiology over the course of 1 and 2 years. And what they found was that even though there wasn't significant damage to these trees by spotted lanternfly, it didn't kill anything, but that doesn't mean it didn't have an effect. Okay. And this is something you need to keep in mind. So the control trees here are shown in these stripy values. And what you see is that that feeding significantly reduced starch, and it significantly reduced non-structural carbohydrates in the roots of these trees. Also, when you look at tree diameter, feeding by lanternfly reduced the tree diameter growth. It also reduced nutrients that are important to photosynthesis and growth. So it's not like it had no effect. But the conclusions of the authors was that because lanternfly were confined to these trees, it was kind of worst case, they were required to feed on these trees, that this would be a worst case scenario, and that true damage in the field wouldn't be significant. Doesn't mean that SLF isn't a problem. To date, it's a stressor on trees. Even in Philadelphia, where we've had heavy populations of street trees that are red maple, that are street trees, right? So their roots are kind of exposed. They're not grown in the best conditions. They're under stress anyway. We've not seen any kind of dieback of those trees. And so where lanternfly has been to date, this is not a problem, but it could, effects of lanternfly feeding could be amplified by other stressors. Okay. What about grapevines? Okay. This is back to that vineyard. This is back to that vineyard where my student was doing that work. This is what it looked like. 40 acres were dead by 2019. This is not typical. There were other issues going on here. This is not at all typical, but certainly the point to be made is that lanternfly feeding damages grapes and it damages tree of heaven. More typical damage to grapevine is kind of what you see here, where you see something to the effect of more localized damage to vines here and there. What we saw at that time is we had Heather Leach and Ashley Leach did a survey of vineyards that were infested with spotted lanternfly. And what they saw was that early on, you had very, very low levels of lanternfly. And granted, these were vineyards that were treating for lanternfly, but it was this spike that came in that late season, which is kind of, corresponds to that timing of the video that I showed you. They come in during the late season, and this is where they cause a problem. Okay. And so what's going on there is that they're coming in right at harvest. Okay. And so why this is a problem, it's because growers, for them to apply anything, it needs to have an extremely short pre-harvest interval, right? And so what you're seeing here is this is a vineyard where they applied Mustang Max because they were, getting ready to harvest. And what you see is that those aren't berries on the ground. That isn't mulch. Those are spotted lanternfly. And so you can see that applying contact insecticides will kill a lot of lanternfly, but the issue is that you only can apply something that is short acting because of harvest. Lanternfly keep coming in and they keep hammering those vines, and that alone isn't enough to ward off the damage that these insects are causing by that heavy feeding. And so basically what we found with just the 5 vineyards in those early years that had heavy lanternfly infestations, we saw some damage. We saw that the growers reported quadrupling their insecticide applications, and that that increased the price, proportionately, and that still wasn't enough to ward off the damage. What is lanternfly doing to the grapevines? This is kind of hard where lanternfly was at this time. It wasn't near where we have any experimental research sites for grapes. This site is where we had these infestations was 3 hours east of the main campus. We have an experimental vineyard there. We have an experimental vineyard in the Erie growing region, which even today still does not have lanternfly. We're very concerned. And then we had at our fruit station in the southeastern part of the state where they have an experimental vineyard. Again, it was not infested with lanternfly at this time. So their growers are fantastic. We had a hobbyist who decided to donate vines. And what he did is donated these vines, and Michaela Centenari and her team, led by her doctoral student at the time, Drew Harner, built these enclosures. They put sap flow meters on it. They introduced lanternfly. You can see here, they found heavy feeding reduces sugar, nitrogen, and photosynthesis. But let me show you a little bit more what that looked like. What they did is into these enclosures, they introduced either low numbers of lanternfly per shoot. I think there were about like 18 to 20 shoots. So, they would put enough lanternfly in so that you had overall 4 per shoot, in each of these things. And so they're putting in, roughly over 200 in the enclosures to get to that, higher density. But they would introduce low, medium, high, or no lanternfly as controls into a particular enclosure, and they would let them feed for 4 days, and then they would remove the lanternfly. And the idea here is that they wanted to simulate what a grower would do. A grower wouldn't let them stay there. They would, detect building up numbers, and then they would treat to remove them. So the experiment removed the lanternfly and then repeated those feeding cycles 5 times. And what they found was that, lanternfly decreases photosynthesis in a way that's based on the number of lanternfly there. So the higher the density of lanternfly, the greater and faster that photosynthesis shuts down. Since that time, lanternfly has expanded its range in Pennsylvania, and so Michaela and our great entomologist, Flora Acevedo, have been putting lanternfly, either nymphs or adults, on experimental grapes at our fruit research station. And what they found has been a little bit alarming, especially in terms of what this means for our juice growers in the Erie region when lanternfly gets there. And what they found is that feeding by adult lanternfly just in 1 year, 1 season of feeding is enough to significantly reduce Brix or sugar levels in the grapes. And so they found that on Chardonnay, and they found that on Cabernet Franc. And so 1 feeding will reduce sugar levels. 1 year of feeding is enough to decrease the total wine phenolics. Okay. And so that's very alarming. 1 year can also decrease root starch. And so again, that's in both varieties that were tested. We don't see a decrease in yield after 1 year of feeding. We to date haven't seen any impact of nymphal feeding. Year 2, though, is 2 years in a row of heavy feeding is when you see that decrease in yield. And that's measured in terms of yield per vine, cluster and berry weight, and number of clusters. There's also decreasing root starch. And so that's kind of where we are. They have, from their numbers this year, no significant impacts of nymphs on any of these measures. That's also after this year, the 3rd year of doing it. They're making wine, and they're looking at wine quality. They'll be looking at juice as well, but I don't have those data. Those aren't ready yet. Okay, so what does this mean for you? And so what does this mean for you? If you look at the current map, that's the one that's still up there at New York State IPM, you see this infestation. And so you might think, and kind of what we're hoping is that, well, okay, lanternfly, yes, in the East and Mideast and Midwest, but maybe it can't persist in areas that are too hot or too dry. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we have 2 additional important, 2 new data points. And so just last week, APHIS confirmed that there is an established population of lanternfly in Fulton County, Georgia. And so that's not too hot. What does that mean for you? Also, Melody Kina, who works for the Forest Service, and she's reared lanternfly. She's the one who has growth chambers. She's been rearing invasive insect pests for this kind of work for her whole career, so for many decades. And she reared lanternfly under both the temperature and humidity, so the dry conditions that would be found in Stockton in Central Valley. And what she found was that, yes, lanternfly can do just fine there. So we have no evidence to date that there's anything that disqualifies California, where we're at now, in terms of the important areas of grape production and Central Valley, nothing that disqualifies lanternfly as being able to establish in this area. She even simulated a week-long heat wave, and it didn't negatively impact lanternfly. What we're concerned with is, could it be the case that you might be able to have more than one generation of lanternfly per year? Females do lay multiple egg masses when they have enough time to do that, but that is still up in the air. But the point is that it can establish here. Okay, what's it going to do to other crops? And this is really hard to tell. Okay. We've done some work. Some of this work was funded by California Department of Food and Agriculture, CDFA. Also, Mark Hoddle's group at UC Riverside has done these host plant suitability studies too. And part of this is, if we say, okay, how do you study whether or not lanternfly can damage these other crops? And so we've done course studies that are essentially force feeding studies. We bag or, we constrain lanternfly to these crops. And the idea is trying to answer the question, is lanternfly able to survive if it's only given this crop to feed upon? That doesn't mean it's going to be damaging necessarily, but the first step is, can it feed on it? And so we've tested adults, first instars and first through third instars on a variety of different crops. And so to summarize that, what we find is that what we've said before, nymphs can pretty much feed on anything, right? Their survivorship is pretty good. We don't have, real reports of damage, no real results of damage to the field, but they can feed on them. Fourth instars, that's where they look to be a little bit potentially more damaging, but again, they'll feed on pretty much anything too, okay? And so, what about adults? We know that, again, if we force feed them, they pretty much will feed on these other things. They do the most damage on a variety of grapevine, varieties and species, which isn't too surprising. And even though we have, they do well on kiwiberry and hops and even raspberries, we don't have any report really of damage. And so, again, these were force feeding studies, so that is a little bit limited. Some work that my postdoc, Holly Sugart's been leading, and my technician Tess, we've been able to mark individual females and mark individual insects, but basically measure their change in mass over time, because if they're losing a lot of weight, that suggests it's not a really good host. But if they're maintaining a healthy weight, then it suggests that that is a good host. And so what you can see here is that, compared to Tree of Heaven grape and kiwi fruit, their feeding performance, their mass goes down kind of fast on hops, citrus, and avocado. And again, these are potted, but I want to point out they're still able to feed for a while, okay? And there were some issues with the quality. We know that they generally do better on hops. So there was something, frankly, weird about this particular trial. And so they reran it over the summer. And the thing I want to point out is that on citrus, what they found was that the nymphs survived up to 90 days on Valencia orange in the greenhouse. It doesn't seem to be a great host. They didn't really develop to adult. Only one individual did. Work coming out of Mark Hoddle's group shows that they just published a paper that, yes, lanternfly can feed on citrus. So are these preferred hosts No evidence that they are, right? Citrus, hops, and avocado. The take home message here is that these other crops like citrus, things that are being grown here, um, they can sustain lanternfly long enough. I don't necessarily think, we have no evidence that they're going to be damaged, that they're going to, really have an impact from lanternfly, but lanternfly can feed on them as they're moving across the habitat long enough to get to more preferred hosts, so long enough really to get to grapes. Okay. I want to show you another study. So, okay, so what can you do about it? Okay, back early in the day in 2018, we did a bunch of trials to try to get label amendments to have insecticides that we could use and growers could use against lanternfly. We continue to update this, but what we found is that they're easy to kill. A lot of different things will kill spotted lanternfly. And so we have this information available in our vineyard management guide and other resources that are available online. It's really, really easy to kill with a variety of insecticides. If we look though at the life cycle, kind of summarizing what we know in terms of how much time lanternflies spend in each different life stage, I'm kind of pointing out this is kind of a simplistic view that we thought from 2017. The life stages overlap a little bit more, but the take home is that eggs are they spend their lives for most of the year in the egg stage, and that lets them get transported if those eggs are laid on other things. Nymphs feed broadly on a lot of different plants. What they feed on is relative to what hosts are there. Their feeding preference depends on what's around it, and it's that adult stage that is really problematic. So early on we thought, well, let's just take them out of the egg stage. How does that work? Well, the efficacy of ovicides is really problematic. Lorsban was found to be the most effective treatment, and that's not available. Recent work has looked at malathion. That hasn't been published yet, but that could be another option. But the issue is, and then even insecticidal oils could be useful. But the problem is that you have to get really good coverage to try to kill them. And here you can see you have eggs up in the tree. If you can get to them to scrape, that'd be great. But the question was, can we get to enough lanternfly egg masses? And so this was a study where trees were actually felled, and and basically the logs were chopped into 3-meter segments. And what we found was that most of the egg masses were laid over 6 meters above the ground. And so egg mass, even if you can get to it and scrape it or treat it, egg masses alone are not going to be the key to controlling this. That's not a silver bullet. It's part of the overall management approach, but in and of itself, that's not really useful. We have degree day models to predict hatch, to know when to go out if you suspect lanternfly in your area. Those egg hatch models are great. We have a map where you can look and say, if you had lanternfly, this is not saying that you had lanternfly. It's just saying that if you had lanternfly, this is how many growing degree days have accumulated, and this is the probability that the lanternfly would have hatched. So you know when you can time your surveys if you're concerned and want to go look for it. Trapping. The earlier traps were essentially like fly paper wrapped around trees. Lanternfly walk up vertical surfaces, and so the idea here is that this would catch them. The problem is that sticky bands can also catch vertebrates. It can catch birds. It's really alarming. So these are bug barrier traps. It's like a baffle, and then the sticky is on the outside. So, and then people have used chicken wire, and we've had ways to adapt these sticky band traps to make them safe to reduce bycatch. So that's one trapping method. There's other ways in our management guide, if for modifying sticky bands. Other traps have been tested. We tested these overall, and the circle trap, where lanternfly again they walk up this skirt, they get funneled and die in this container. it'll kill lanternfly. It reduces bycatch dramatically, and it catches a lot of lanternfly if you have high densities. But if you're in low densities, especially sites where you're trying to do, early monitoring of new infestations, this isn't the best thing. There's no pheromone that's known for any plant hoppers. They tend to use substrate-borne vibration. There were studies done in the lab that showed that there were certain like plant volatiles, certain pheromones that lanternfly were attracted to. One of those was methyl salicylate that was made into a lure. We tested that methyl salicylate lure, and what we found was that there was no difference in capture rates. The lure doesn't work. So that's kind of problematic in terms of where we are with trapping. As I mentioned, in terms of lanternfly moving in, it's this late season movement that is a problem. The nymphs, for growers in our region, they're applying insecticides for other things, often, Japanese beetles at that time. That'll knock down any nymphs so they don't go through the trouble of scraping egg masses. They're applying an insecticide early season anyway. It kills the nymphs that are there. It's this late season that we have to worry about. And so you might want to say, well, why can't you just kill lanternfly in the surrounding area and get rid of that reservoir that comes in? And I want to share a study with you again, so you kind of understand what you're up against here. This study kind of shows the complexity of what we're dealing with. What we did is we focused on red maple and trapped out and tracked lanternfly on red maple trees over the course of 2 years. And we don't have a red maple experimental ornamental plot. And so what we did is connected with a housing development, and those little dots are 20 red maple trees. Those red maple trees were all planted at about the same time when this development was built. And so they're all about the same size and age. And so these were suited with sticky band traps. And these sticky band traps were left up for the whole life cycle for 2019 and 2020. The adults don't really do great. They don't get caught in sticky band traps. So collaborators came in and collected lanternfly off these trees. And so what I'm going to show you is basically what we found in terms of how many lanternfly were on these bands over the course of that field season. So you can see they'll be collected. We let the bands accumulate lanternfly until they were saturated, then take them off and count the bugs, put new ones back on. And again, the adults were hand collected off as well. And so this is what it looked like over the course of the season in terms of average number of lanternfly per tree. The egg stage, each egg mass that was observed is estimated to have approximately 38 eggs. So they counted the number of egg masses, multiply it by 38. What you see is you had an average of 475 bugs per tree. If you trap them off every week, you see your numbers drop, right? You would think, oh, we're trapping them out, we're trapping them out. What happens then with the adults? Boom, those adults are coming in. They're coming in from elsewhere. So suddenly you have an average of 615 bugs. And then again, they're removed every week. Then when the egg masses were laid, for those that were, able to still lay egg masses, the egg masses were counted, multiplied by 38. How many bugs were there? You see it's 615. I have to change the scale because that's how many more insects came in. Still, that many eggs were laid. That number basically just increased. These are the numbers. This red maple is a preferred host in late season, but what you can see here is that they're still on it. Okay, they're on it all the way through the year. And kind of what this shows us and what we've learned kind of since then is that lanternfly are constantly moving. They're constantly moving through the landscape. And so if we look in this environment, you can see, yes, there's tree of heaven. There seems to be a reservoir that they're moving in from, but that's not enough to account for those numbers. Okay. And so at this vineyard in Allentown, that's where you can see patchy damage from spotted lanternfly. There's no tree of heaven in this vineyard. What you see these are some old black walnut trees. They were coming in from those. And so if you move out and you say, okay, in the landscape, Where is the reservoir? Yeah, maybe there's some tree of heaven here. There's distribution centers that trucks come into in this area that ship goods. And if you move out, we have this patchy landscape habitat. So it's not that there's any one reservoir that you necessarily can treat. The lanternfly are constantly moving on the landscape. And so that's kind of what we're up against in terms of trying to manage. Should we remove tree of heaven? That's never been empirically tested. That certainly might help prevent lanternfly from establishing in a new area. But it's also a way to, you could treat it with dinotefuran, treat it as a sentinel trap tree, look there, because lanternfly would be more likely to appear on tree of heaven in a new area. There is a biological control agent that's been tested and it has been developed. It's not available. It's still going under EPA registration, non-target testing, that kind of thing. But it's expensive to treat tree of heaven. But this verticillium non-alfalfae could be a biological control agent that might let us test whether or not getting rid of tree of heaven is an effective management tool. Leave you on a positive note. We're trying other things. We're trying treated versus untreated netting. We're trying exclusion netting, trying the netting, it's not necessarily cost effective, but it could reduce lanternfly. Also doing things like perimeter sprays, trying to work smarter, not harder, to only spray areas that are along edges. This might be an effective way to go. We're still working on it. And I do want to mention that two more take-home things. One is that in these areas, we've seen kind of almost a collapse of spotted lanternfly, where the densities had been really high in the early years, and they seem to drop off. But lanternfly, what we've learned from growers, they still come into vineyards. They still come into vineyards at the late season. So we still think that they're attracted, something about the volatiles or whatnot, that lanternfly continues to remain a problem even when populations ebb in those vineyards. There's work that USDA APHIS is doing on biological control agents. There's one that is a natural enemy of lanternfly in its native range. It's been tested. They have it under quarantine. They've been working on it since like 2015 or 2016. This egg parasitoid seems to be too much of a generalist, but there's really promising work on a dryanid. It wrestles lanternfly nymphs and lays their eggs in the nymphs. This is really promising. And just these last 2 days, I've worked with Mari West, who's coming from Mark Hoddle's lab from Riverside. And, they're optimistic. They're looking at, as lanternfly expands to different areas, you're going to come into, they're going to experience different conditions. Some of those might be different natural enemies. And so what they're working on is they're looking at, and other folks at University of Delaware are looking to see, as lanternfly expands its range, are there other natural enemies that are already here that are parasitizing eggs? Yes, it seems to be the case. There's a stink bug egg parasitoid that's using lanternfly egg masses, and some of the cool work that Mark Hoddle and his group and Mari are doing here in your area is that they're looking for parasitoids of native plant hoppers, and they're working with the folks in the East to test to see if lanternfly will be parasitized by those native plant hoppers, but they're also looking at plant hoppers here to help move along that testing of the dryanid so that it might be ready for release here before you have a lanternfly problem. So with that, I'd like to thank CDFA, APHIS, our funders, and thank my big team. And with that, I'm not gonna get into that. And with that, I will stop sharing and maybe have a quick 2 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Julie. Real quick, everyone, I'm launching the next poll. You can answer that at any time. We do have 2 minutes. So, any natural predators of lanternfly?
Yes, there are. There are generalist predators. We're seeing things like wheel bugs, mantids. Birds don't seem to like them, but a lot of arthropod predators. We seem to see an uptick in populations of wheel bugs, for example, of certain things. They'll even lay their eggs near lanternfly eggs, but we haven't really measured that. So again, there are a lot of generalist predators, but nothing that seems to be a silver bullet, just general predation.
Are pears like apples and stone fruit less damaged than grapes?
Definitely. And we have not had any reports of damage to any of those at all.
Are any of those effective insecticides for spotted lanternfly organic?
Oils are effective. And so I would say, so yes, I think some of those are organic, but I would recommend you look at again, insecticidal soaps are also effective if you get good coverage. But please check out the website, go to Spotted Lanternfly, Penn State Extension, Spotted Lanternfly Management, and you'll have good lists of all of that.
Does Bacillus thuringiensis control spotted lanternfly? BT.
That has not been tested to date, but that's a great question.
You
We have
have
we have other things, or we're pursuing a proposal for another round of funding, and we're looking to specifically test lower risk insecticides. And so BT would be something we'd be interested in testing.
Why not focus on treating the tree of heaven, which is highly invasive? Kill two birds with one stone potentially.
That's a great question. We don't know that it's going to work. It might just force lanternfly onto grapes or other hosts faster. And it's super expensive and not easy to do. And so investing those resources when you might make it worse doesn't make sense at this point. But again, with tests using that verticillium non-alfalfae to determine in what context, could removing tree of heaven ahead of an infestation be helpful? There's work that Tracy Lesky is leading to look at that use of that verticillium as a biological control agent of tree of heaven around vineyards in Virginia. But we don't have any results yet.
With the difference in climate between Pennsylvania and California, is there a possibility that we would see spotted lanternfly adults populations spike earlier in the season? Does this also potentially open more opportunity for multiple generations?
Yes, you would see them earlier in the season. Some of the stuff that I'm working on is looking at, I'm doing head-to-head comparisons of lanternfly I've collected in Rochester, Pennsylvania, Nashville, and North Carolina, and I'm looking at their mass and their increase in mass over time, because that's how heavily they're feeding. And I'm looking at their reproductive development to determine if they're reproducing earlier. So we're definitely looking at that. That could mean that they have multiple generations. Data are still out with that, but even if they don't have multiple generations, if they have that longer feeding time, which my preliminary results suggest that they do, if they're feeding more heavily longer, that could mean that they're going to have a greater impact on host plant. They're going to deplete the host plants more, and they potentially could have a bigger window to lay more egg masses, and so have larger populations.
Okay, thank you so much, Julie. That's the last of the questions. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.